The letter trembled in my hands, though I tried to keep my fingers steady. Jacob's signature, bold and careless, bled across the bottom like a knife slash. "You're terminated," he had said, voice smooth as marble, while Melissa stood at his side with a smile too sharp to be kind. My chair scraped against the polished floor as security waited behind me, silent shadows ready to escort me out. 8 years of building this company. Late nights, unwashed coffee mugs, lines of code that carried my heartbeat, erased in a moment. I swallowed hard, but inside something else stirred. A secret only I knew. The mornings were always mine. Before Jacob stirred, before emails and deadlines and Melissa's shrill laugh echoing through the office corridors, I had 1 hour of quiet. The apartment was high above the city, but when I cracked the window, I could still smell the bakery downstairs. Yeast, sugar, butter. Reminders that life could be simple if one wanted it to be. I padded barefoot into the kitchen, laptop already under my arm. The kettle hissed to life. Steam curled, soft and forgiving, as I opened the screen and watched lines of code glow to life. To anyone else, they were symbols. To me, they were sentences, rhythms. Code was the only language I trusted completely. "Already working?" Jacob's voice would sometimes rumble from the doorway, amused but never curious. He never asked what I was building, never leaned over my shoulder the way I once wished he would. Instead, he'd pour his coffee, scroll through his phone, and mutter about stock prices. I used to wonder if love was meant to sound like that, distracted, transactional, folded between schedules. But then I'd close my laptop and remind myself, I wasn't coding for his attention. I was coding for something bigger. At the company, they used to joke that I was the ghost in the machine. Not because I was cold. I smiled easily, laughed when others didn't expect me to, but because my presence was always inside the work. The office was glass and steel, too polished for comfort. I liked the hum of servers in the basement more than the gleam of conference tables upstairs. Down there, it smelled of metal and faint ozone, and my hands always itched to type. "Brenda," Melissa would say, high heels tapping like a metronome across the floor. "Jacob needs projections for the next quarter. Can you send them by lunch?" I'd nod, fingers flying over the keyboard. She never waited for my answer. Melissa lived in performance, lipstick too red, smiles too wide, her laughter a little too loud when Jacob was near. But I ignored it. What mattered to me was the system I had built, the core framework that carried every transaction, every confidential deal, every digital thread of the empire. Sometimes, when I worked late and everyone else had gone home, I'd sit back and watch the screen glow with its quiet pulse. It was alive in its own way, a map of logic and trust. My creation. My proof that I mattered. Jacob would call from his office upstairs. "Still here?" "Just making sure everything holds," I'd answer. He never came down to see what everything meant. He liked the surface, the numbers, the quarterly growth, the parties where he could raise a glass and boast about how we had built it. But the truth was simpler. I had built it, and he had worn it like a crown. Back then, I told myself it didn't matter. That maybe love was letting someone else take the stage while you worked the shadows. That maybe marriage was compromise. But compromise has sharp edges. And the cuts take time to show. The first sign was small. Almost forgettable. Jacob stopped coming home for dinner. He said the board needed him late. Or investors were demanding calls that stretched into midnight. I believed him. Or rather, I wanted to. Marriage, I told myself, was built on trust. And if that trust sometimes felt like a hollow room, echoing and cold, well, maybe that was just the cost of ambition. But then came Melissa. At first, she was only a colleague, sharp, efficient, the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. I admired her in a way. Even envied how easily she fit into Jacob's world of power suits and sleek smiles. She carried herself like someone who had already won. "Melissa's a star," Jacob told me once, pouring whiskey into a glass without offering me any. "She sees opportunities before anyone else." I nodded, but something in his tone made me uneasy. It wasn't admiration for her work. It was hunger. The second sign was harder to ignore. A meeting in the boardroom. I had spent 3 weeks perfecting a new security framework, a design that would not only protect our assets, but save millions in risk management. The screen lit up with my diagrams, my code, my hours of labor. And yet, as Jacob began the presentation, he used words like we, like our team, like Melissa and I. She sat at the far end of the table, nodding as though she had written every line herself. "Excellent vision, Melissa," one of the directors said, mistaking the architect for the actress. I opened my mouth, ready to correct him, but Jacob's glance cut me off. A warning. A dismissal. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Jacob snored beside me. The realization pressed heavy against my chest. My work was no longer mine. My voice had been edited out of the story. The third sign was the one that broke me. I came into the office early as always, to find Melissa already there. Her heels were off, tucked under the desk, and she was perched comfortably in Jacob's chair, sipping from his mug. She looked up at me, slow and deliberate, like a cat that had claimed a new corner of the house. "Brenda," she said lightly. "Jacob asked me to review the new compliance module. You don't mind, do you? We just want to make sure everything's in line with the board's expectations." The word "we" stung more than her smirk. By the end of that month, my access was restricted. Files I had once opened without question now blinked error messages. When I asked Jacob, he sighed, as though I were a child interrupting him. "Brenda, you've been overwhelmed lately," he said, his tone measured, rehearsed. "We're worried about you. Melissa thinks you should take some time off." "Melissa thinks?" My voice cracked before I could stop it. He didn't flinch. "You've been working too much. It's affecting your health, maybe even your judgment." It was then that I understood. He wasn't just silencing me, he was erasing me, one careful stroke at a time. The day it ended, I was called into his office. The blinds were drawn. The air smelled faintly of Melissa's perfume, a scent that made my stomach twist. Jacob slid the termination letter across the desk. His hand was steady. Hers rested lightly on his shoulder, fingers tapping in rhythm with my heartbeat. "You'll thank me one day," he said. "This is for your own good. You need help. A break from all this." The words blurred. Help. Break. Terminated. I wanted to scream, to flip the desk, to tell him that the empire he was clutching in his greedy hands was mine as much as his. But my throat closed, and all I managed was silence. That was the second realization. Silence was what they wanted. And as security walked me out, past the glass walls I had once thought transparent but now felt like prison bars, I promised myself one thing. If they wanted silence, I would give it to them. But not forever. I thought leaving the office would mean relief. That once the glass doors shut behind me, I'd finally breathe. But days blurred into weeks, and silence became a second skin. No more pings from my inbox, no hurried footsteps in the hall, no hum of servers in the basement. Instead, I sat in my apartment surrounded by the shadows of who I had been. My laptop was still there, but access to the company systems had been stripped away, piece by piece, until all I had left were fragments of old files. And yet, the ache wasn't just in what I had lost. It was in what they continued to flaunt. Melissa filled the company's social feeds with staged photos, shaking hands with investors, standing proudly beside Jacob at shareholder dinners. She wore colors that clashed with the steel gray walls of the office, making her the focal point of every shot. And always, in the captions, Jacob credited her. Our brilliant COO, Melissa Carter, leading innovation. Melissa spearheaded this initiative with flawless execution. Not a word of me. One evening, unable to resist, I streamed a live board announcement. Jacob stood at the podium, sleek suit, easy charm, Melissa just over his shoulder. His voice carried confidence, but I could hear the rehearsed rhythm beneath it. "We're entering a new era," he said. "An era of growth, of trust, of leadership that puts people first. And I couldn't do this without Melissa." The audience clapped, but I felt a strange heat climb my throat. Trust. The very word mocked me. When the applause died down, Melissa leaned toward the microphone, her smile sharp. "And let's not forget," she said. "We've streamlined operations after making some difficult but necessary decisions. Sometimes, change requires letting go of what no longer serves the company." I froze. She didn't say my name, but she didn't need to. The smirk in her voice was enough. That was the fresh wound, being erased in public, not just behind closed doors. To them, I wasn't simply gone. I was disposable, a discarded note in their symphony. Later that week, Jacob sent me an email. Not personal, not kind, just a thinly veiled legal warning. Brenda, we expect full confidentiality moving forward. Any attempt to claim ownership of company property will be considered a breach of contract and dealt with accordingly. For your own well-being, I encourage you to focus on your health, not the past. Jacob, health. Past. Confidentiality. The words pulsed like shackles. For a moment, I sat there, staring at the screen, my pulse loud in my ears. Then slowly, I began to smile. Because he had forgotten something. The empire wasn't as airtight as he believed. Buried beneath the glossy framework and polished reports, there were foundations only I understood. Layers of code that weren't written on any visible record. My language, my private architecture. Invisible to them, vital to everything. A house built on steel can still collapse if you know which bolt to loosen. The insult of Melissa's words, the arrogance of Jacob's letter. They didn't just reopen old wounds. They lit the fuse. But revenge wasn't immediate. It couldn't be. Not if it was going to be clean, precise. So I poured coffee into my chipped mug, opened my old laptop, and let my fingers hover above the keys. The screen reflected back my tired eyes, my hollowed cheeks, but also something else, a flicker. A fire I hadn't seen in months. I wasn't ready to scream. Not yet. But I was ready to write. Sleep abandoned me. Nights stretched like wires pulled too tight. I would lie in bed, the city lights bleeding through the curtains, listening to Jacob's absence echo in the emptiness. No low voice in the next room, no clinking of ice in his glass, no rhythm of typing from my own desk. Just silence, heavy and suffocating. Sometimes I'd get up, pacing barefoot across the wooden floor. The boards creaked under my weight, familiar sounds in an unfamiliar life. I'd catch myself running a hand over the bookshelf, over the framed photographs we'd once displayed proudly, Jacob at a conference, Melissa hovering at the edge of the shot, me smiling like I still belonged. I stopped turning on the lights at night. Darkness was easier. In it, I could admit the truth. I had been erased, overwritten, and replaced. But the mind resists silence. Mine replayed everything. I remembered the early years, when Jacob and I worked side by side in a cramped co-working space. Pizza boxes stacked in corners, half-broken chairs, laughter over late-night bugs in the system. He would fall asleep with his head against the keyboard, and I would nudge him awake with coffee. Back then, it felt like ours. A partnership. And then Melissa came, bright and polished, sliding seamlessly into the gaps Jacob had grown tired of filling. She laughed at his jokes I'd heard 100 times. She made him feel larger than life. I had seen it happening, but I told myself I was paranoid. That love meant patience. That loyalty was stronger than seduction. How wrong I was. By the third night without sleep, I found myself at the kitchen table, my laptop open, the glow staining my face pale. Fingers hovered over the keys, trembling, not from weakness, but from hunger. I remembered the code I had built, deep inside the company's systems. A quiet failsafe meant only for me. It wasn't malicious then. It was insurance. A way to protect the empire if anything went wrong. No one else even knew it existed. Jacob never cared enough to ask, and Melissa never had the skill to notice. I opened an old file, hidden under innocuous names, and the lines of code blinked back at me. Familiar. Waiting. My chest tightened, breath shallow. Could I? Would I? Another memory rose. That day in the boardroom, when Melissa took credit for my work, when Jacob silenced me with a glance. I had swallowed the humiliation, believing silence was survival. But survival without dignity is just a slower death. The clock on the microwave read 3:07 a.m. My stomach growled, but hunger no longer mattered. My body was buzzing, restless. I typed one line, then another, testing, adjusting. My pulse steadied with each keystroke. This wasn't just revenge. It was reclamation. Proof that I still existed, that the empire they paraded around as theirs was still tied to me in ways they couldn't see. I leaned back, rubbing my eyes. The apartment was silent, but in my head, I heard the hum of servers, the faint static of wires, the pulse of a system alive with my fingerprints. For the first time since the firing, I didn't feel erased. I felt inevitable. The first attempt failed. I had spent hours mapping the hidden pathways inside the system, my pathways. They were still there, untouched, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. But when I tried to slip through, the door slammed shut. A new firewall. Melissa's doing, no doubt. My laptop screen glowed with a blunt rejection. Access denied. The words mocked me. For a moment, the fire in my chest dimmed, replaced by a cold wash of panic. What if they had found it? What if, in their arrogance, they had scrubbed away the last trace of me? I closed my eyes, forced myself to breathe. No, that wasn't Melissa's style. She was bold but careless. She loved being seen. And Jacob, he never looked beneath the surface. If the firewall was there, it was standard protocol, not a targeted strike. Which meant my secret code was still buried deep, waiting. But I couldn't be reckless. A single mistake could trigger alarms, expose me, make me the villain in a story they were already writing. So I pulled back. Waited. The waiting was harder than the work. Days stretched long, filled with silence and static. I forced myself into routines. Morning walks to clear my head, coffee brewed strong enough to mask the tremor in my hands. Notes scribbled on scraps of paper with equations only I could understand. I pinned them on the fridge like recipes no one else would ever cook. But every night, the laptop called me back. The glow lit my face, and the hum of the fan was the closest thing I had to conversation. The second attempt was more cautious. I disguised my entry as a maintenance check, piggybacking on a forgotten test server. Fingers flying, I rerouted through layers of encryption, pulse quickening with each gate I passed. And then success. The screen filled with familiar code, lines I had written months ago. It was like finding an old diary in the attic, my handwriting staring back at me, proof that I had lived, created, mattered. But before I could dig deeper, the system glitched. A red warning blinked at the corner of the screen. Someone was monitoring traffic. I yanked the connection, heart pounding. I spent the rest of the night pacing the apartment, palms sweating, stomach clenched. If Melissa had seen the spike, she'd report it to Jacob. They'd tighten security. They might even accuse me openly, brand me as unstable, dangerous. And yet, the taste of that brief success lingered. For a moment, I had touched the skeleton of their empire, and it had recognized me. The next morning, I forced myself to think not just like a coder, but like a strategist. Revenge wasn't just about crashing systems. It was about timing, precision, spectacle. Destroy them too quietly, and no one would know the truth. Destroy them too violently, and I would become the villain. No, what I needed was exposure. The empire had to collapse in plain sight, with everyone watching. Their arrogance had painted them on the tallest stage. My task was to pull the curtain at the right moment. So I tested slowly. A line of code here, a false signal there. I mapped their weak points like a surgeon feeling for the right artery. Every move documented, calculated, refined. But with each step forward, doubt pressed in. What if I was wrong? What if, when the moment came, the code failed? What if I stood there, humiliated, while Jacob and Melissa laughed, triumphant once again? At night, when exhaustion blurred my vision, I heard Jacob's voice in my head. You need help, Brenda. You've lost your judgment. And Melissa's echo. Sometimes change requires letting go. I would grip the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't broken. I wasn't gone. They had taken everything, but not this. One evening, while testing a dormant subroutine, I stumbled onto something unexpected. A message I had left for myself. Months earlier, before everything fell apart, I had coded a simple comment in the system. If you're reading this, it means you still have control. My throat tightened. For the first time in weeks, I laughed, a sharp, shaky sound that startled me in the quiet apartment. I still had control. The setbacks hadn't broken me, they had sharpened me. Each failure was another layer of patience, another stitch in the fabric of my plan. I began to dream of the moment. Not in wild fantasies, but in grounded detail. The boardroom filled with investors, the smug tilt of Melissa's smile, Jacob's practiced charm. And then, silence as the code I had built, the code they had stolen, turned against them in plain sight. 10 minutes. That was all it would take. 10 minutes to dismantle 8 years of arrogance. I closed the laptop gently that night, palm steady, mind clear. For the first time, sleep came easily. Because now, the strategy was complete. All that remained was the stage. The boardroom gleamed like a stage, every surface polished to reflect power. Cameras were set up along the back wall for the live stream. Investors, clients, even the press were watching. Jacob thrived on these moments. He stood at the head of the long table, suit sharp, voice measured. Melissa hovered nearby, leaning forward just enough to seem indispensable. Her lipstick was the same shade as victory banners. I watched from the corner, unnoticed. They hadn't expected me to accept the invitation. A courtesy email sent, perhaps, to flaunt their dominance. But here I was seated quietly, my laptop balanced on my knees like nothing more than a notebook. Jacob's voice carried across the room. Today, we show the world that this company has never been stronger. Our systems, our leadership, our vision. I tapped the first command. The screen behind him flickered once, then steadied. No one noticed. Melissa adjusted her papers, her eyes sweeping the room with ownership. Our latest framework guarantees security at levels unmatched in the industry. Investors can trust us to keep every transaction, every client completely safe. The word trust almost made me laugh. I entered the second line of code. This time the screen glitched again, longer. The company's logo warped before snapping back into place. A few board members exchanged glances, but Jacob pressed on, his smile ironclad. Minor hiccup, he said smoothly. These things happen. I pressed the final sequence. My pulse slowed. 10 minutes. The timer began. At first it was subtle. Numbers on the projection screen twisted into gibberish. Charts inverted themselves, profits sliding into losses, losses climbing like mountains. A director leaned forward, frowning. What's happening? Jacob's smile faltered. He clicked his remote, but nothing changed. Behind him, Melissa stepped forward, whispering urgently in his ear. Her confidence flickered. Then the emails began. One by one, phones around the table buzzed, screens lighting up with alerts. Security breaches. Accounts inaccessible. Clients locked out. Years of data scrambling into unreadable strings. Panic rippled through the room. Voices rose, sharp and confused. Is this a hack? Shut it down. Where's IT? Jacob raised his hands, desperate. We're in control. Just a system overload. But he wasn't. The servers hummed louder, the company's own heart betraying him. Every lock I had built, every safeguard only I knew, was collapsing into chaos. Melissa tried to step forward, her voice pitched high. Everyone remained calm. And then the screen shifted, clearing into a single line of text. This system was built by Brenda Carter. Without her, it does not exist. The words glowed in stark black and white, undeniable. Silence fell. Heavy. Crushing. My hands didn't shake. I closed the laptop gently, the timer running down the final seconds unseen. Jacob turned, his face pale. His eyes found me in the corner. And for the first time, I saw not arrogance but fear. Brenda, he hissed, low enough for only a few to hear. What have you done? I met his gaze calm. I told you once, I built this. You just wore it like a crown. Melissa's mask cracked. Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked smaller now, stripped of her stage. The timer hit 0. The screen went black. The servers fell silent. $8 million. Gone. The fallout was immediate. Directors shouted, phones rang, security rushed in. Cameras captured every second, broadcasting Jacob's downfall to anyone watching. His empire hadn't been stolen by rivals, nor sabotaged by strangers. It had imploded, revealed for what it was, hollow without me. I stood slowly, slipping the laptop into my bag. No one stopped me. They were too busy watching their empire crumble in real time. As I reached the door, I glanced back once. Jacob stood frozen, Melissa clutching his arm, both drowning in the wreckage they had tried to build on my back. The truth was exposed. The empire was dust. And I was free. The morning after, the city felt different. I stepped out of my apartment and into the hum of traffic, the air sharp with the smell of exhaust and roasted chestnuts from the corner vendor. Life went on, taxis honked, shopkeepers rolled up metal shutters, a child tugged at her mother's coat. None of them knew that, only hours ago, an empire had collapsed. That was the strangest part. The world didn't pause for Jacob's downfall. It had never really been about him. I bought a coffee from the bakery downstairs, the same place whose scent had carried me through countless early mornings. The barista smiled at me, not knowing she was handing a small ritual back into my hands. I took the first sip and felt the bitterness settle cleanly on my tongue. Upstairs, my laptop sat closed on the table. For weeks, it had been a weapon. Now it was only a tool again, quiet, unassuming. I turned on the news. Jacob's face filled the screen, but it wasn't the confident mask he wore so well. It was pale, strained, eyes darting as reporters shouted questions. What happened to your systems? Is it true a co-founder was erased? Where is Brenda Carter? Melissa was there too, silent behind him, her red lipstick smudged, her smile gone. I watched without flinching. There was no satisfaction in their humiliation, only clarity. They had chosen betrayal. They had built their power on my silence. And now, silence had destroyed them. For the first time, I didn't feel erased. That afternoon, I packed away the photographs from the bookshelf. Jacob shaking hands with investors, Melissa lingering in the background, me smiling with a faith I no longer recognized. I slid them into a box and taped it shut. Some memories weren't worth displaying, but not everything was pain. In the same drawer, I found an old notebook filled with ideas I had scribbled years ago. Small projects, sketches of systems that had nothing to do with profit margins or investor meetings. Pure creations born of curiosity. I traced the ink with my finger, remembering the joy of solving puzzles for their own sake. That evening, I carried my coffee to the balcony and watched the city lights blink on. The skyline shimmered, glass towers reflecting the last strokes of sunset. For once, I didn't feel like I was looking up at someone else's empire. I felt level with it. A neighbor's radio played faintly through the walls, some slow melody that drifted into the night. I closed my eyes and let the sounds settle into me. I thought of the girl I had been. The one who stayed late in the basement, humming with the servers, believing silence was survival. She had been patient, loyal, hopeful. Too hopeful. Now I was something else. Not louder, not harder, but clearer. The empire was gone. Jacob and Melissa would spend years clawing at the rubble, trying to salvage reputation, chasing after investors who would never trust them again. That wasn't my concern anymore. My concern was simpler. What I wanted next. I didn't have the answer yet. But for the first time in months, the question didn't terrify me. It felt like possibility. I leaned against the balcony rail, the night air cool on my skin, and breathed deeply. For years, I had coded in silence, built in shadows, waited for someone else to notice. Now I didn't need anyone's permission. The shift wasn't in them, it was in me. And that was enough. The apartment was still. No ringing phones, no urgent footsteps, no sharp voices cutting through the air. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the steady tick of the clock, the small reminders of an ordinary life. I sat at the table with my laptop closed, hands resting lightly on the cool surface. For weeks, it had been my battlefield. Now it was just a machine again. Through the window, the city pulsed with light, towers flickering like constellations, streets alive with motion. Once, I thought I needed to climb those towers, to carve my name into the skyline beside Jacob's. But the truth was simpler. I had built something far greater. The proof of my own resilience. People would talk about the collapse of his empire for months, maybe years. They would speculate, blame, search for answers. But the real story wasn't theirs to tell. It was mine. I thought back to the girl who once stayed late in the server room, listening to the hum of machines as if they were breathing with her. She had been silenced, dismissed, erased. Yet she had also written her survival into the very bones of the code. That was the part Jacob never understood. That my strength wasn't noise, it was persistence. Quiet, steady, unshakable. I wrapped my hands around a warm mug of tea and took a slow sip. The steam rose, curling into the air before fading into nothing. Not everything needs to last forever to matter. Some things are beautiful because they end. The empire was gone. My marriage was gone. My illusions were gone, but I was still here. And for the first time, that felt like enough. I closed my eyes, breathed deeply, and let the night settle around me like a blanket. Tomorrow, I would decide what came next. Tonight, I allowed myself to rest in the simple truth. They had tried to erase me, but I had written myself back into the story. And this time, the story was mine alone.